Good evening. Good evening. Oh yes, I almost did that like Alfred Hitchcock. Good evening. The talk that I have prepared for you tonight is about South Park, something that I knew very little about before I started my research. I happened to be at the Fall River Historical Society doing some work for them, doing some cataloging, and ran across a book that I had never seen before that inspired me to get totally involved in this concept, this idea of what happened to South Park, where it came from, why it happened, and why it is the way it is today, and what can be done, etc. So without further ado, first of all, I learned about Frederick Law Olmsted through video. There are multiple books about him in the world, but PBS did a documentary about the urban landscape movement in the United States and specialized on Olmsted. So what I have done, probably quite illegally, is take that video and reduce it down to its bare minimum just to share with you tonight some of the details of Olmsted's life. It's easier for me to it's easier for me to show you than for me to tell you about this remarkable man. So there's a short documentary that I'm going to show you now about Olmsted and the urban park movement, which will perfectly segue into Fall River history and his impact here. So it is called The Olmsted Legacy.
In the middle of the 19th century, before automobiles, skyscrapers, interstate highways, and shopping malls, an ordinary citizen, Frederick Law Olmsted, had a vision for America's cities.
We want a ground to which people may easily go after their day's work is done, and where they may stroll for an hour, seeing, hearing, feeling nothing of the bustle and jar of the streets, where they shall, in effect, find the city put far away from them.
Throughout his career, Olmsted designed over 500 nourishing green spaces in all corners of the country.
Olmsted, he's one of the towering figures in the history of American cities, the history of American landscape.
He was the forefront of the anti-sprawl movement.
There would be no national parks without Olmsted, state parks without Olmsted's vision. I mean, he was there in the beginning.
The Olmsted legacy shaped this nation.
He was effectively creating palace grounds for common people.
The guy who works 6 days a week in the factory, brings his family here, stands on this hillside and says, "This is our estate."
In the middle of the 19th century, public parks did not exist in American cities. While wealthy citizens retreated to their country estates, poor city dwellers had no escape. New York City was unhealthy. Crammed into overcrowded tenements, people lived on top of each other in squalor. Sanitation and waste methods were primitive. The stench was intolerable. Disease widespread.
And the city leaders realized that what do we need in New York to make us compete with the great cities of the world? And two things that really popped out. One was you needed fresh drinking water, and then two is you needed a great park.
The man who would build this park, transforming the 19th century American city irrevocably, was Frederick Law Olmsted. Born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1822, Olmsted at an early age was introduced to the hardships of a 19th century existence. Olmsted was 4, his brother John 1 when their mother died. His father, John Olmsted, a prosperous dry goods merchant, remarried shortly thereafter and had 4 more children. Olmsted and his brother John became close and adventurous friends. With their house as full as it was, Olmsted's father elected to send Olmsted away to receive his education at a series of boarding homes. Nature became the one constant that Olmsted could turn to throughout his tumultuous childhood, and he quickly developed a fierce independence.
When 14, I was laid up by an extremely virulent sumac poisoning. I was troubled for several years with a disorder of the eyes, and the oculists advised that I should be kept from study.
It was expected that Olmsted would continue his education at Yale, but in light of his condition, he turned instead to a young life of work and the outdoors. Back home in Connecticut, Olmsted felt pulled toward the land of his childhood.
Rural tastes at length led me to make myself a farmer. I had several years of training on widely separated farms, then bought a small farm for myself.
22-year-old Olmsted studied the art of the gentleman farmer and enrolled in Yale as a special student, studying science alongside his brother and friends. He began reading the agricultural journals of Andrew Jackson Downing, who would give landscape new meaning to Olmsted.
Andrew Jackson Downing was the leading landscape gardener and writer about landscape design in the 1840s.
Downing showed Olmsted that a new America could be made, one where cities and towns could be planned to include public parks, where greenery could uplift even the poorest citizens. It was at his Newburgh estate that Downing first introduced Olmsted to his architectural assistant, the young Englishman Calvert Vaux, who would soon play an invaluable role in Olmsted's career. With Downing's encouragement, Olmsted, at 28, took a walking tour of Europe with his brother John. They lived on pennies a day and saw for the first time the democratic urban parks of Europe, in particular, Liverpool's Birkenhead Park.
Olmsted and his friends were amazed that the people of Birkenhead themselves had created this. It was not something that was given to them by a prince or king.
Here was a park that was used by many people, working people as well as middle-class people, and they were all kind of mixed together.
This was the sort of institution that they thought the American Republic should be providing for itself.
In democratic America, there was nothing to be thought of as comparable with this people's garden.
He was also impressed with the overall coherence of the design, the way that the walks and the drives moved through the landscape, the way that different kinds of experiences were achieved in different parts of the park. And all of those were elements that were in his mind when he started to design Central Park a number of years later.
Shortly after his return, Olmsted chronicled this trip to Europe, publishing Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England. It was the first of many successful published works. Ever more enticed by the promise of literary success, Olmsted sold his farm and, having established himself as a roving correspondent, went to tackle the southern United States.
As a journalist, he traveled throughout the United States on this long tour of the South, sending weekly reports to the New York Times, a brand new New York Times. So he got very good at going into a situation, as a journalist does, and sort of understanding it very quickly.
After traveling the plains of Texas and the bayous of Louisiana, under the pseudonym Yeoman, the former vagabond farmer found he had developed a literary reputation in New York. Word of his success quickly spread. It was due to his new esteem and also to chance that Olmsted was led to the job that would become the most important of his career. The city fathers had set aside land in the center of Manhattan for a new park so that rivaling neighborhoods from the east and west could appreciate it equally. The site for the park was a large plot of swampy, rocky land occupied mostly by squatters.
It was just at that time that the new commissioners were looking for a superintendent of the parks.
The obvious choice to bring New York's Central Park to life would have been Andrew Jackson Downing. Tragedy struck, however, when a steamship accident took Downing's life in 1853. Olmsted believed in Downing's idea of a great park for New York City. Tapping into the knowledge he gained as a journalist and gentleman farmer, he began avidly lobbying to become the superintendent of Central Park. Olmsted was named superintendent of Central Park on September 11, 1857. He was 35 years old. 2 months into his new job, news came that his brother and dear friend, John, was fatally ill with tuberculosis. John Hall Olmsted left behind his wife Mary and 3 children, John Charles, Charlotte, and Owen. A deep grief settled upon Olmsted. Again, he turned to nature to find solace, but this time his focus was on making it accessible to others. As talk increased about who would design the park, A.J. Downing's former architectural partner Calvert Vaux campaigned to see his late partner's dream realized.
Egbert Ville, who was an engineer, had been hired to design the park, and Vaux looked at Ville's plan and decided it was a disgrace, and a disgrace to the memory of Downing. So Vaux undertook the political games necessary to have Ville's plan derailed. He arranged for there to be a public competition.
So he approaches Olmsted, who has just become the new superintendent, and says, look, you understand the park, you're there all the time, your local knowledge will be crucially important for the creation of a design. If the two of us join together, we can have a fine design.
Olmsted says no, because he doesn't want to step on his boss's toes. His boss is Egbert Ville, the engineer, but Vaux must have pushed and pushed and pushed Olmsted. So Vaux got Olmsted to approach Ville, and Ville was like, yeah, whatever, do whatever, who cares? And of course, they have the winning design.
When Central Park is built, is a very important moment, not just because it's a big park in New York City, but it's really the first big urban park in any American city. The closest comparison to Central Park was the American cemetery, so that in an odd way, it's the cemetery is the precursor to public park. People would go to our picnics to cemeteries. Whether or not you had somebody close to you in the cemetery, they were beautiful green spaces.
Vaux and Olmsted developed their design over the winter of 1857. Olmsted working on the plan late into the night after dealing with his daily superintendent duties. Their design, which they called Greensward, was sinuous, with large expanses of open meadows and wide, winding paths.
A drive must so be prepared that those using it shall be called upon for the least possible exercise of judgment as to the course to be pursued, and that they shall be free from the disturbance of noise and jar.
They called for thick copses of trees to line the park's borders so that visitors would see on all sides not street traffic or stone buildings, but a seemingly unending woodland. It was passion that Olmsted claimed sustained his taxing work on the park. Ever since a failed engagement to the daughter of a high-profile Connecticut lawyer in his early 20s, he gave up on love, substituting instead work. Olmsted opted for a marriage of duty to his brother's widow, Mary Perkins Olmsted, in June 1859. They were married in Central Park. Olmsted and Vaux would ultimately devote 15 years to designing, constructing, and supervising Central Park. By the fall of 1859, over 17,000 trees and shrubs had been planted, and construction on the park had been finished up to 79th Street. At peak times, as many as 4,000 workers were employed, and Olmsted later estimated that nearly 5 million cubic yards of land had been moved.
Or nearly 10 millions of ordinary city one-horse cart loads, which, in single file, would make a procession 30,000 miles in length.
By the summer of 1860, Olmsted's energy was depleted, and his health failed by the day. When his horse spooked on a drive through Upper Manhattan with his wife and newborn son, Olmsted suffered a crippling broken leg. His recuperation, long and slow, was delayed further by the loss of his son from cholera just a week later. By the winter of 1859, the pond near the southern entrance to the park had frozen, and citizens on ice skates came in droves. The following summer, the board approved free Saturday afternoon concerts, which became hugely popular. Olmsted estimated that on many days, nearly 100,000 people visited the unfinished park.
The time will come when New York will be built up, and when the picturesquely varied rocky formations of the island will have been converted into foundations for rows of monotonous straight streets and piles of erect angular buildings. There will be no suggestion left of its present varied surface, with the single exception of the park.
150 years later, this is the most incredible democratic space that you can imagine. He wanted a place that all New Yorkers and visitors could come into, and when you came through those walls, we have all become one. That is the most important thing that he wanted, and there's absolutely no question that was created.
After Central Park, Olmsted really drifted away from landscape architecture. He wasn't a designer, he wasn't somebody like Vaux who saw his future in design. He thought he might be a publisher, he might be a civil servant, he got involved in the Civil War.
Of chief concern to Olmsted was providing public service that would improve the lives of American citizens. The same kind of civilization that he brought to the people of New York, he would impose upon the Union Army troops. He was appointed General Secretary to the United States Sanitary Commission, which was in charge of the health conditions of Union troops. It was the precursor to the Red Cross. The troops were ill-equipped, overworked, and demoralized. As conditions worsened, Olmsted wrote,
There has been one sanitary measure to be thought of now, and that is discipline. The health, comfort, and efficiency of the Army are all united in their dependence on a strict, uniform, and all-pervading military discipline.
Olmsted at once employed the use of his notorious organizational skills, successfully creating a relief system on a national scale that included ships that would transport wounded soldiers along rivers rather than bumpy roads.
When he did work, he was very immoderate. He would throw himself into his work, he would get caught up in it emotionally and mentally.
George Templeton Strong, treasurer of the Sanitary Commission, ironically called his life habits insanitary, remarking,
He works like a dog all day and sits up nearly all night. Doesn't go home to his family for 5 days and nights altogether. Works with steady, feverish intensity till 4 in the morning. Sleeps on a sofa in his clothes and breakfasts on strong coffee and pickles.
By 1863, Olmsted's relationship with Strong and the Sanitary Commission had grown tenuous. While his management skills were unparalleled, he often butted heads with his superiors. When the new owners of a large gold mine in Mariposa Valley, California, offered him the position of superintendent, he accepted. It paid handsomely, and he found comfort in being able to suitably provide for his new family.
I think going to California was very important in terms of his landscape architecture preparation, because he sees a totally different landscape. He sees a landscape of enormous scale, these great mountains around the valley, the wildness of it.
In August 1864, Olmsted was appointed to the Yosemite Commission, presenting a treatise on the importance of reserving the area for the public and petitioning for a carriage drive that connected the valley with the closest major road. This magnificent landscape, he believed, should be accessible to all of America.
Originally, Brooklyn, the great Brooklyn, was a separate city and very competitive with the city of New York across the water. So the city fathers of Brooklyn were headed up by a guy named Mr. Stranahan. And Stranahan had commissioned a design for a new park. He went to Calvert Vaux, who was still here in the city, and said, well, what would you do differently? And Vaux is actually the hero in this story, because he said, oh, you would never leave Flatbush Avenue in the middle of this park. That was a big mistake we made in Central Park. We had to have those transverse roads. And you should buy land over here, you should do this and this, and he sketched it out. So Stranahan was thrilled, and he said, wow, I would love to have you do this, and he said, I can't do it without Olmsted.
I think Vaux convinced Olmsted to leave California, to come back and join him and work on this. Olmsted kind of resisted this all the way.
Vaux wrote Olmsted repeatedly. Think this over, he said. We are neither of us old men, you know. To me, it seems and always has seemed a magnificent opening, possible together. impossible to either alone. In the end, Vaux's promises that the two would be able to return to their work in Central Park lured Olmsted east. The park space that Vaux proposed was almost perfectly sanctioned off from the busy streets of Brooklyn. It called for no transverse streets, like those that had constrained the meadows and woodlands of Central Park. The land of Prospect Park, unlike Central Park's rocky swamp, was easy to mold and perfect for what would become Olmsted and Vaux's classic park. Thrilled by this new promise of freedom, Olmsted and Vaux began construction in July 1866. With that freedom, they created the Long Meadow, 90 acres of rolling pastoral landscape, a full mile in length, the largest open space in any urban park in the country.
Olmsted and Vaux viewed Prospect Park as a classic design, partly because of the extent of the Long Meadow itself, the achievement there of the pastoral landscape that Olmsted thought was crucially important for every park.
What he stresses about parks is that you got away from the city to receive the psychological calm that you needed. That mental refreshment is what he called it, and that's what he was really searching for and assumed everybody else was searching for, which we are, particularly in cities.
And that therefore makes the park what Olmsted called the most valuable antidote to the artificiality of the city and particularly counteractive of the stress caused by modern life.
I think urban park systems are as important as urban road systems, urban transit systems. They're the basic building blocks of healthy cities, beautiful cities, attractive cities, cities people want to live in.
Olmsted and Vaux were suddenly in demand across the country. City leaders had seen the successes of Central and Prospect Parks, and they wanted urban parks of their own as fast as possible. Olmsted treated each new commission as an experiment, bringing new ideas in park building to life. In Buffalo, he and Vaux were asked to design not just one park, but a park system for the entire city.
Olmsted, throughout many projects, was trying to find ways that parks could reach into the city rather than making people go to the park. You could take the park through neighborhoods. And his parkways and boulevards, which sound just like big streets, but they're really green streets. They have trees down the center, trees on each side. They have places for, sometimes for horse riding in the middle.
He was so intrigued with this idea of parks to parks and how that actually builds a city. Because as we all know, he was a fabulous city planner. And so that connecting of cities by pulling their neighborhoods together, building those neighborhoods through parks was really amazing.
Olmsted traveled extensively for his work, with his family firmly rooted on the East Coast. Mary, since their marriage, had given birth 3 times. 2 sons were lost. A girl, Marion, survived. The birth of his son in 1870, christened Henry Perkins after Mary's father, was a milestone for Olmsted. Rejecting his Christian name, Olmsted referred to him for a time as Boy, before officially naming him after himself when the child was 4. John Charles, by this time, was already hard at work in his father's office.
It's 18 years between John Charles Olmsted and Frederick R. Olmsted Jr., but both of them were really being groomed by their father to take over the business.
As Olmsted's sons became more involved, his partnership with Vaux suffered. Vaux felt continually slighted by the recognition Olmsted received for the pair's work. Olmsted, meanwhile, disagreed with Vaux's conception of their profession. Vaux saw themselves as artists. To Olmsted, they were public servants, shaping the social nature of the cities they changed. The two parted ways in 1872. Olmsted accepted a commission from Boston, where he would come to work and eventually live until the last years of his working life.
It was a group of thoughtful, enlightened citizens who brought him here and said, design us a park system.
concerned government leaders called on him to fix the city's unhealthy waterways, which were unsightly and rapidly spreading disease.
Two of the earliest parks were actually engineering projects as well as parkland. They were the Back Bay Fens and the Riverway Park. The Muddy River sanitary improvement was really designed to convey stormwater and sewage. And the Back Bay Fens was a tidal marsh that was fouled by years of raw sewage dumping into it.
It's called the filthiest marsh and muddy flats to be found anywhere in Massachusetts. So when Olmsted first comes up here in the 1870s, his job, as he sees it, is a very practical one. It's to help regulate the water flowing into the Back Bay Fens, to stabilize the environment. Most 19th century cities, if they had a water course running through it that became polluted, they would just put it underground and forget about it. Olmsted thought, though, that if you work with engineers, if you work with thoughtful design, you could actually keep these water courses open and then provide a, a nice green, verdant environment.
Eventually called the Emerald Necklace, the park system is a ribbon of green cutting through the city of Boston, connecting the centuries-old Boston Common with the sweeping expanse of Olmsted-designed Franklin Park.
Frankly, he gave the city of Boston its aesthetic shaping.
I really do think that the gift of Olmsted Parks to communities has meant that there is common ground, that there is something we all earn and own together, and that it is that fabric that makes your community vital, and it is the kind of thing that you lose at your peril and that you gain as a gift.
From Fairstead, his new home in Brookline, Massachusetts, the Olmsted firm, which then included stepson John Charles, and would soon include his son Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., he embarked on some of his most recognized works. The United States Capitol needed grounds to complement the majestic building. Olmsted found a way of subordinating his landscape to the architecture. It was in Chicago, however, on the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival to America, that Olmsted was able to plan a city from scratch.
Chicago decided this would be the biggest and best fair ever. Daniel Burnham was one of the chief organizers. He brought in all these architects to design buildings, but the first thing he brought in was the best planner in the country, who was Frederick Law Olmsted. And Olmsted, the first thing he said is that the best thing about Chicago is your lake.
And so he said, the thing you want to display most clearly is Lake Michigan, and nothing else, unalloyed, so that you get the full, strong sense of the presence of the lake and the sublime power of the lake.
For the World's Columbian Exposition, Olmsted sought to cohesively combine the grand architectural statements of legendary architects Daniel Burnham and McKim, Mead, and White.
And the plan of what became known as the White City, the exposition, is another example of Olmsted's versatility as a planner, because one of the things about the classicists, McKim and Burnham and all these great architects, is that they had a very rigid idea of how the White City should be organized.
Olmsted ultimately reshaped not just individual cities, but the landscape of America. In his working lifetime, he was asked to carry out over 500 commissions across the country: urban parks, academic institutions, public buildings, and private estates. Eventually, the movement spread beyond him, and cities from Philadelphia to San Francisco began to subscribe to the idea that cities deserved green spaces. Soon, the entire country was being painted green. His goal remained to bring a sense of psychological well-being to others. His own health, meanwhile, deteriorated to a new low as he suffered from insomnia, chronic headaches, fatigue, and constant ringing in his ears. Doctors were unable to diagnose one specific ailment and therefore rarely offered any cure. Rather, they concluded he simply worked himself sick. As his health worsened, he focused on training his sons to take over the firm. John Charles had already been formally taken on as head draftsman and would become partner of the firm in 1884. Olmsted worked to make sure his younger son would follow the same path. At Biltmore, the Vanderbilt Mansion and Olmsted Sr.'s last project, it eventually became necessary for Frederick Jr. to take over for his father. Olmsted by then was suffering from a form of dementia, unable to communicate clearly with his staff. It was also at Biltmore that the revered American painter John Singer Sargent was working on a portrait of Olmsted to hang within the walls of the estate. Sargent had Frederick Jr. finish sitting for the portrait once his father retired at the age of 75 in 1897. Olmsted's last years were wrought with confusion and depression. Eventually, the family relented, and Olmsted was admitted to McLean Hospital in Waverly, Massachusetts. It was his second visit to McLean. His first had been in 1872 on a commission to design the hospital's grounds. This time, they disappointed him.
They didn't carry out my plan, confound them.
Olmsted died on August 28, 1903, at age 81. His son Frederick was by his side. A small funeral was held at Fairstead the next day, and he was buried unobtrusively and without pomp in the Olmsted family gravesite in Hartford, Connecticut. After his father's death, Frederick dropped the Jr. from his name, and thus it is widely held that the work of Frederick Law Olmsted spans more than 100 years. The Olmsted firm continued to design landscapes in the drafting rooms of Fairstead until 1979. By then, the firm had completed 6,000 commissions with more than 700 public parks, parkways, and recreation areas.
Olmsted's legacy was to keep nature in cities. He let Boston and New York and Buffalo and 1,000 other places keep their rural roots intact even as their cities grew around them.
In all my life, I have never seen such joyous collections of people. I have in fact more than once observed tears of gratitude in the eyes of poor women as they watched their children thus enjoying themselves. When the arrangements are complete, I see no reason why thousands should not come every day to use them. Who can measure the value, generation after generation, of such provisions for recreation to the overwrought, much confined people of the great town that is to be?
I couldn't have said it better. There's a lot of important points that are made in this documentary that I highlighted that apply to Fall River specifically that I'll touch upon again as I talk. The mistakes, the successes, the choices, and that seem to plague and benefit other communities as well. So the goal of the urban park movement in the public sphere, according to Olmsted, was to stimulate simple, natural, and wholesome tastes and fancies, and thus to withdraw the mind from absorption in the interests in an intensely artificial habit of life. Space and cleansing sunlight, broad tree-lined avenues and places for recreation were among the civilized necessities for the psychological and physical well-being of urban dwellers. A city ripe for this kind of movement was, of course, Fall River. He considered parks an area for social democracy. This is an image of Olmsted on the right, your left, and Vaux on the other side. Fall River's history. We have to go back a little bit. Most of you know this information, so I'm only rehashing something that you are already quite familiar with. Fall River has always been, or in the past, a one-industry town. It is great mill expansion, and 11 mills were constructed in 1872 alone, importing thousands of foreign workers, with a population explosion over 10 years of over 250%. At one point, the city population was 120,000 people. That was the highest it ever was. The city strained to respond to housing congestion, social problems, dislocation, and disease. And water bodies, rivers, ponds, streams, and swamps, divided the early settlements into different villages. And what was lacking in Fall River was a public park. The city had a muster ground for military drills and had a lot where farm produce was marketed, but there was no common of any cultural significance. No public promenade or green existed to relieve the pressure of the population living in squalor and confined in mills. So the poverty and living conditions in Fall River were absolutely horrendous. Tenement housing along the mills was where people lived and then worked. Cholera epidemic in 1854 in Fall River caused 130 deaths. An 1882 investigation into the living conditions in Fall River found, quote, the most wretched filth and decay abounding in all quarters. In 1894, another study said it was an unspeakable place. It would be an abuse to house a dog in such a place. And he's talking about mill housing in Fall River. And wages were lower in Fall River than other textile communities. The average yearly wage for a man was below subsistence levels, which forced children and women to go to work in the mills. And laws against children working in the mills were not rigidly enforced. And yet, beyond all of this, there was no moral force for social reform by any clergy of any ethnicity in this city. So there was nobody speaking out for the poor. There was nobody speaking out for anybody. It was just the way it was. Fall River, according to one observer, was, quote, a monument to division, an aggregation of houses on ill-made and worse-kept streets with no great buildings reflecting its united character as a city. So socialization in Fall River. Remember, Olmsted is interested in social democracy in his public parks. So what about socialization in Fall River? We have all these disparate groups of immigrants coming from different places. What about that? Well, each mill had its own company housing. Mill colonies developed along the water sources, and the workers were specialized. So they did specific jobs based on what they were brought in to do, and they were often the same ethnicity, so they stuck together. So there was very little socialization from one ethnicity to another. And ethnicity was separate languages, churches, and customs. Also bars and meeting houses and public places. Everyone seemed to segregate themselves in their own ethnicity. So there wasn't this democracy of socialization happening in the city. But post-Civil War prosperity created an opportunity. And in 1868, Fall River joined the ranks of the enlightened cities to acquire parkland to serve its population. The Lancashire workers were used to a tradition of free, open public parks to serve working men and manufacturers. And so there was an acquisition of 2 parcels of pasture land for parks, the Durfee Chase Farms and the Ruggles Grove. In 1870, Fall River contracted Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux to assess Fall River's potential for a park and parkway development. So we have a park movement in Fall River. Yay! August 1853, a committee on the subject of a public park purchased 32 acres of Stevens Farm for $15,000, but it was considered too far to walk for the laboring class. Park Committee in April of 1853 considered a square near the center of town, but it was too small and close to the smoke and the railroads and the wharfs, and there was no place to ramble. In June of 1855, an exchange was negotiated with Dr. Nathan Durfee. He purchased the Stevens Farm acreage for the $15,000 that the city paid, and he sold the city, that was the deal, I'll buy the land if you buy something from me. He sold the city 47 acres at $200 an acre, which would eventually become Oak Grove Cemetery. Oak Grove Cemetery is a firm descendant and a part of the urban parks movement, in the urban cemeteries movement, excuse me, rural cemeteries movement in the United States, and it was intended as such. According to the Fall River News editorial board stated, a park, quote, should be chosen at the top of the hill, on the western slope of which the town is built. Here, the land could be procured, doubtless at a reasonable price, and it would be many generations before it would be wanted for business purposes. The air would be salubrious. The prospect of whichever side the eye should be turned would be pleasing. The hum, roar, smoke, and dust of the city would not annoy, but the spirit of retirement would there reign. I'd love to see the Fall River Herald News use the word salubrious in any article or editorial that they might write. So the land, where are we going to put it? All right. In 1860, I have to go back, 1680, a little bit, a couple of hundred years before, to the Pocasset Purchase, so you understand where this land comes from and how it was formed. The Pocasset Purchase was land purchased from the Indian for 1,100 pounds. It was incorporated into the town of Tiverton. It was surveyed and separated into classified divisions of 30 shares each, determined by drawing of lots. Now, each lot was 50 yards in width, which is about 100 acres, and it extended from Bay to Plymouth Avenue. Now, the first great division, the house lots were in a fan-shaped strips extending inland from the Taunton River, leaving a common land highway along the watershed. The third Pocasset great lot was drawn by a man named William Manchester, who sold it to Matthew Borden and Thomas Durfee. Thomas passed his share to his son Benjamin Durfee, who later acquired the Borden holdings, and part of the south part was sold to Oliver Chase. And here's Mr. Chase. It remained as farmland until the city purchased it in 1868. Here is an image of the Pocasset First Division from Phillips, excuse me. You'll notice here on your left-hand side, the numbers 1 through 30 that go down beyond the picture. This is what we're talking about. You see Cook's Pond, it looks like it says Cook's Pond there. So there's Cook's Pond. This is the Taunton River over here, all right? Down here is another pond. I think it's Stafford Pond, is that correct? Stafford Pond. So here we have the division, and this is up there. Now, at the top of the picture, the very top, that line that goes straight across, Fall River is on the other side of that, Fall River, Massachusetts. This is Rhode Island. The demarcation line between Rhode Island and Massachusetts was established in 1740 by Royal Commission and then revised in 1791. The King's Award Decree was measured along the shoreline instead of a straight line, which turned out to be a big problem later and actually created what is now Fall River when it was reversed. They ran it through the southern part of the village of Fall River at the old Buttonwood Tree. This is the old Buttonwood Tree. Thank you, Fall River Historical Society, for this image. This is a picture of the Buttonwood Tree. Does anybody remember or know where the Buttonwood Tree stood? Columbia and Rodman. That was where Rhode Island began. So everything south of the Buttonwood Tree was Rhode Island, and actually Tiverton. And everything north was Massachusetts. At some point, we had a Fall River, Massachusetts, and a Fall River, Rhode Island, because it was Fall River Village where it segregated. So half of what we now know as being Fall River was a part of another state because of the King's decree. And that's how they demarcated it, with the tree, the Buttonwood Tree. So if you stood on one side, you're on the other state. Here we go. Here's a map from 1858, I believe. And here is the line. You notice this is where the wards start. So if you've ever wondered why Ward 1 is where Ward 1 is, it's because that was the beginning of Fall River. That was the beginning of Massachusetts there, Ward 1. The line, the yellow line, was the demarcation line between Fall River, Rhode Island and Fall River, Massachusetts. notice South Park is in Rhode Island, as is the Globe Village, as is most of the Quequechan River over here. So this was how it was. In 1844, another commission began and finally pushed this through to the United States Supreme Court in 1860 to determine the true boundary. The Supreme Court hired surveyors and experts, and in 1861, yay, Supreme Court, 11 square miles were obtained by Massachusetts. They determined that they should have done it in a straight line instead of by the coast. So 9 square miles with a population of 3,600 became a part of Massachusetts, and with a taxable property of $2 million. So Fall River made out. And also, I need to mention briefly the Sarah Cornell story, because South Park is where that happened, the murder of Sarah Cornell. So in 1832, John Durfee, on his farm, found hanging in his stockyard at the bottom of the hill the body of Sarah Cornell, the mill girl from the Anawan Mill. This portion where she was found is now the northwest portion of the park. Now, some of you know the story of Sarah Cornell. I am not going to go into it in any detail at all, but I wanted you to just briefly go over that it was the story of a Methodist minister with an invalid wife. His name was Ephraim Avery, a pregnant mill girl, Sarah Cornell, secret letters, clandestine meetings, a trial, a huge trial with over 200 witnesses, and Avery was acquitted on June 2nd, 1833. This is a rendering of Durfee's farm with the stackyard at Fall River where she was found hung. This is the site of Sarah Cornell's death, the Durfee and Robeson farms south of Fall River. This is before it was Fall River, after the unsigned sketch in an Avery trial papers. So this main road to Newport that's at the top, I think we determined that that was Broadway. Is that correct?
Yeah, Broadway.
Broadway at the top. Yes. This is Sarah Cornell's grave in Oak Grove Cemetery. She was buried at that farm in which became South Park. Then she was moved once to another location, undisclosed location on that farm after people went to visit it, and Durfee didn't like that there were people coming to visit this grave, and then she was finally relocated into Oak Grove Cemetery, where she rests today. So here's an 1812 map of Fall River. I want to show you a couple of maps to show you where how the city developed in terms of population and how far things were from one another. When they talked about the Stevens Farm being too far for people to walk to in order to enjoy a park, that was significant. They weren't going to put a park where people couldn't access it. The line here is also the division. See the division line here? That's that same division line that we were talking about in the other map. Here's the 1854 map. You can see the Durfee Farm. You see the beginnings of that area there, which is going to be South Park. 1858 map. We still have the division. This is the map I showed you earlier, and this is where South Park is going to be located. South Park land. Deeds dated April 30th and November 6th, 1868. Fall River acquired the Durfee Chase Farms at $1,000 an acre. Ruggles Grove, a wooded rocky tract of 15 acres, was also purchased. $3,300 was appropriated for improvements. Remained unspent. Parklands were rented for pasture, and that's what they were. They acquired the land, but they didn't have the money to do anything with it, so they just rented it out for cows and sheep, I think. Mounting pressure from public and the newspapers for civic improvement of these locations. And in 1870, Mayor Samuel Brown proposed it should be an energetic program of public works, called for a plan, and the city responded by hiring Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux to make that happen. Here's the 1877 map that we're all familiar with. You can see South Park, where are we? Over here. It extends right down into the bay with the railroad track coming by it, separating the lower area all the way to the middle area and then the upper area. And that'll be significant in this story, that area at the water. And here's a close-up of that section. It's very elongated in this picture. It's really not that long. But you see the railroad? Yes. And here's an 1883 map that shows it actually designated as South Park with Broadway, is that right? Going right through the middle of it. And we have Middle Street and Durfee Avenue, which is now Bradford, is it not? But that's his first name, Bradford Durfee. So here we go. This is 1891. 1891. South Park. It was the first park in Massachusetts to be designed by Olmsted Vaux and Company. So it was before the Boston Emerald Park system. He came here first. The plan was completed in 1871, but the upper section only was built to his plan. That's the part that's closest to the cathedral. That's the only part of the park that they actually spent money on to make it Olmsted, as Olmsted designed it. And in 1904, a revised plan was implemented by the Olmsted sons. Now that's the stepson and the natural son of Olmsted, who formed the Olmsted brothers. So, but Olmsted's son, remember in the documentary, took the junior off his name so that it would still be the Olmsted Company. So that's often why people say we have an Olmsted Park when they have an Olmsted Sons Park, but it's the same company. So some of the parks in Fall River are not Frederick Law Olmsted parks or designed by Frederick Law Olmsted's firm. He's dead by the time things happen there. But Fall River only had enough money or only had enough energy to do something with the top part, and I'll share you with that. So in 1870, Olmsted and Vaux visited Fall River. The Fall River Daily Evening News noted the visit and said that Olmsted and Vaux, quote, expressed their admiration of the many beautiful views which our city and its suburbs present, but criticized the narrow streets. The report praised the Bay Park. That's the lower portion of the South Park land that overlooks the Taunton River for views, and recommended purchasing that shore property to be added to the parkland. They were less impressed by Ruggles, which looked out upon the backyards of dwellings. Unfortunately, the records of the design, the original design of South Park, were destroyed when the City Hall fire occurred in 1886. So all we have left are general plans without any working drawings. The firm the firm's contract with the city was terminated in 1872. The choice of Olmsted and Vaux reflected a cosmopolitan taste and values of wealthy leaders and a love of civic beauty. Unfortunately, the history of South Park's development reflected also the continuing inability or unwillingness to pay for such beauty. So the 1871 plan, this is what we know. This is from this great book that I found at the Historical Society called The Kennedy South Park, History of a Public Landscape in Fall River by Arlen Levy, and she is an expert on urban landscape and Olmsted. And she created this amazing book. Here is the general plan for the layout of the park. On your left is the upper section, right, which is closest to the cathedral with St. Anne's, the middle section, and then the lower section. So there's 3 sections that it was divided into. So let's talk about Olmsted's recommendations. He said we're going to omit any artificial water within this park at all. Because what do you have? You've got that water right there. We're up on a hill. We're looking down on the Taunton River and Mount Hope Bay. This is absolutely phenomenally gorgeous. We want everybody's eyes to go to that. We don't want any fake water, any artificial streams. We don't need that in this park. We're going to use the natural beauty of the bay. So he said none of that. He had provisions for congregations of people seeking different types of recreation. Cricket was a big thing back then. baseball, concerts, and the solitary stroller. Also, back then, people liked to go out and take horse-drawn carriage rides. So there's provisions for like paddocks and horse areas for that, and areas for horses to trot. So we're thinking of another time. The upper section, that's what we're talking about, that section I told you about. It's flat. They called it the green, and it was to be used for a parade and ball ground. They wanted tree-lined pleasure drives on all four sides, parkway planting strips, tree street planting, rows of trees along the edge of the parade ground. He, quote, shut out the view that would be inharmonious with and counteractive to our design. Closely planted trees to hide the buildings, self-contained space, and no structures within this area at all. So the whole point was like in the video that you saw, where you'd walk into it and you wouldn't see, hear, or know that there was a city around you. Here is that section. All those little dots are trees. So he wanted trees, he wanted copses of trees, he wanted it to be an open area in the middle, but also surrounded by these higher areas of trees so that you could get away. The middle section. In his design, he wanted to encourage interaction in the middle section. Carriageways with watery vistas, looking out over the Taunton and the bay, healthful breezes, scenic views, some shelters, a building complex for that, terrace wrapping around a pavilion with a roofed music L, and entry veranda connected to stable yards and paddocks. Sheds in a hollow, heavily screened with plantings, so you didn't see these kinds of buildings. And when pedestrian walks and carriageways intersect, a tunnel or a bridge system constructed in a picturesque manner to disappear in vegetation like in Central Park. So you wouldn't have people moving about in carriages at all intersecting with people walking. Something would go under the other or over the other so that there would be no danger of anything happening there. He wanted to have an enlarged sense of space with a continuous series of changing vistas within and without the park. So here's his middle section design. Notice the curvy, kind of meandering, very, very sinuous design of the ways through. Again, trees along the outside, completely around the outside, so that again you had a sense. He had the meadow. He constructed a meadow, not as big as Prospect Park, the long meadow, but he believed that every park needed a meadow, an open area for people to have a picnic on or just enjoy grass instead of concrete and buildings. The shore section. Carriageway, after crossing Bay Street and the railroad tracks, terminates in viewing concourse on a tableland above the water. So you went over the bridge and you were above the water, and then you would go down into the water. A parallel walk would bring pedestrians to a balcony overlooking the water with a staircase to the beach. Between Bay Street and the railroad tracks in the southern quadrant, he wanted a ramble of irregular, disconnected, featureless conglomeration of ground so that people could just be there. The southeast corner of the ramble, he wanted an arbor. And here's that shore section. It's very hard to see because I had to blow it up so big, but see, the railroad goes through. There is a bridge overlooking a carriageway that goes above, it looks like the railroad, and then possibly something that goes under the railroad for pedestrians, but they both sort of come to a concourse, and then you could go down and use the beach if you choose to use the beach. But again, something lovely and enjoyable for the community to have access to a park that extended right to the beach water. Now here's a view of the middle section looking west in the 1890s. Note King Philip Boat Club and Staples Coal Wharf at the shore. This is in that book that I pulled a lot of this information from. So this is a very rare photograph of the middle section in the 1890s before nothing was done to the middle section. You'll see some cows, perhaps. It was still used for pasture land. In 1890, Olmsted, and Elliott was contracted to explore the North Watuppa as a recreation area. Now, this is interesting. Elliott visits Fall River to inspect the North Watuppa, and he comes up with this grand idea for picnic groves, ball fields, bicycle paths, and curving pleasure drives around the North Watuppa to make it a recreational beauty. Of course, that doesn't happen. It's a great idea. So now we go to the 1904 plan. This is the sons and stepson of Olmsted. This was their master plan. Now it's reversed from the other picture. So you'll notice on this side is the upper section, the middle section, and then the lower section with the water. So this is the Olmsted brothers' plan to come. They came back in to look at it again and see what can be done. And they're very different than the seniors' idea. They were very rational, analytical, ordered, architectural, less romantic. They had an ordered aesthetic. They suggested linking parks, playgrounds, small parks, large parks, boulevards, parkways, and city squares. They were advocates of that same idea of connecting a park to a park to a park. They thought that we needed tree-lined boulevards that would connect north to south, north to Ruggles, north to Lafayette, those kinds of things, so that you would feel that you were, that people were being, that they could enjoy a peaceful walk without having to go to the park, but once they ended where they were going, they would be in the park. So they wanted this linkage of these smaller parks to the larger parks within the city, and they suggested that. They have an amalgam of site observations, preliminary designs, and working plans. And we partially implemented the design affecting the process on this derivation of this plan. So the Olmsted's working process, when they go into a place to design a park, they have initial consultation. They set a fee, which included a report of findings and recommendations. They do a thorough topographical map. Financial terms and time span of engagement is laid out. They prepare a preliminary general plan. They do working drawings, the specifications for the work to be done, recommendations for contractors to enter the bidding, where to order and how to order the plant material, and they were the ones that approved the payment of the contractor's bills to make sure things were done properly. So they didn't just give you this design, they actually stayed and helped it happen. This is how they worked. This is how Fall River worked. It butted right up against it, unfortunately. Budgetary constrictions. $200 fee for the consultation, that's it, all right? And report that were quoted by John Olmsted to Philip Borden, reduced to $100 with no report. So they came in, they did a consultation, but they didn't write up the report because Fall River didn't want to pay them the extra $100. The visit notes included strongly worded cover letter that said no part of this is to be published or given to the newspapers. The reason being, they were the ones that were going to explain it to the public. That was a part of what you paid them for. They would explain it to the city fathers, they would explain it to the population, they would explain it to the newspapers, so that everybody would get on board with the same project. But because Fall River didn't want to spend the extra $100, they didn't get that. And because a published report was used for public education, that's how Olmsted did it, to explain the philosophy, a lack of information would always cause a big stir and public ignorance, which is exactly what happened. George Gibbs, an assistant from the firm, was brought in to prepare the mayor and the park commission to educate the public and the press. So they bring this guy in to sort of explain stuff, but it's not the brothers. So they signed a contract on May 19th, 1902 for 3 years, $1,800 in 6 semi-annual installments, plus reimbursements for expenses. And then expenses were negotiated at $2,000, and they reached it by August, so they were through with that really fast. The contract expired on May 20th, 1905 at a critical point of unfinished work in North Park and extended to the end of 1905 at a reduced rate. The Park Commission renewal of the contract was not completed. Olmsted advised the workforce needed for the organization and training, which takes time, was single supervisor, contract labor for groundwork, masonry, bridge, building, and fencing by experienced day workers to do the walks, cultivating, seeding, and planting. The work in Fall River was done by unskilled labor, earning less than $2 a day. So nobody was trained in the work that they were performing. Olmsted preferred contractor withdrew because he said Fall River is a hotbed for labor troubles. Not doing it. So we have a park commission and a superintendent. However, there's all this political infighting. Everybody's a political appointee. Nobody has any real power. What else is new? Charles Smith, superintendent of Oak Grove, was named the park superintendent of parks and cemeteries in 1902 without any hiring power. He was a political appointee without the ability to manage any of the crews that were working in the parks. Howard Lothrop, an engineer in Philip Borden's office, he was the city engineer, oversaw the work in South Park, and he became park superintendent in April 1904, and it's Howard Lothrop who saved the day. He actually knew what he was doing. He worked in the engineer's office, and he had a brain, and he had the experience, and he made it into something that it never would have, but it didn't ever really become what it was supposed to. But he did a good job. So here's a picture by George Gibbs, who came down to help tell the city about the plan. Photographed of the playground from the southwest corner in 1903. Middle Street Parkway. Note the fence along the park edge. Here we have that great division between the street and the park. And this parkway is still there. It's paved and broken and ugly. And I don't think there's trees. A couple of trees. But notice the little fencing over here on the side of the park. John C. Olmsted photograph of the middle section in 1902 when they came to do their extra plan. Note the grazing cows. John C. Olmsted photograph of the shore looking south, circa 1902. Note the view of the Staples Coal Company wharf. South Park from Bay Street looking east, 1908. There's the pavilion. Mm-hmm. South Park in 1917, view of the Wading Pond looking toward the Concert Grove. It was getting there. This is a photograph from the Library of Congress of South Park. The entrance to South Park does not look like this today. I wouldn't, it's okay if you don't recognize it. Here's a picture of South Park also from the Library of Congress site. Beautiful, isn't it? There's even park benches. What's a park without a park bench? It's South Park. 1871 and 1904 plans. Let's look at the difference between them. Here is the upper section. This is, in 1871, Olmsted wanted gently sloping, unstructured greenswald intended for active sports and mass congregation, separated by the city by tree-lined parkways, with a green divided into ball fields and cricket creases, with under drains intended for active sports. The 1904 plan urged men and older boys should not be allowed to play at all in this area because it was dangerous to walkers on the paths. And in fact, when the Olmsted brothers were there in 1904 to prove their point, somebody hit a ball from a ball field and it conked a kid on the head right in front of them to show how dangerous it was for that to happen. And they were men playing baseball. The walks, they said, should be 12 feet wide, smooth, hard, well-drained, dark color concrete, which was a huge mistake as the sidewalks blew up from the heat 3 times when they laid them down. It was very weird. They devised catch basins and drains connected to the sewers at Bradford Avenue and Middle Street, and moving structures, fountain, and the urinal. So they wanted to move all the structures and the fountain and the urinal. Yes, there was a urinal in the park, and it wasn't hidden. In this upper section, there was a urinal for the guys who played ball. They couldn't go home, so they created a urinal, and they wanted it moved into like the bushes and, you know, and hidden a little bit so it would be more private and also less gross. Here's the middle section, the Olmsted Brothers planting plan for the middle and the shore sections from 1903. The middle section in 1871 was undeveloped. They didn't do anything with it. It was bare, windswept pasture used for grazing cattle of nearby dairy farms. So nothing that Frederick Law Olmsted had designed was implemented then. But in 1904, they said, that varies somewhat from that of the 1871, though it includes some of the same general features. So they took what was before and they built upon it. See, things had happened to some of these locations in between that they had to take into consideration. They wanted, a pond had been added to the middle section. That was not a part of Olmsted's plan, and they said, well, we're going to enlarge that. Women and children were users of this section, and the expansion of the wading pool and the women's and children's building would happen. Play equipment to keep children out of the upper section, since the men seemed to want to play baseball there, and excavated boulders set in a steep slope. So they took the boulders up out of the ground, which is really cool, and they placed them in scenic places. That's what they decided. And they have been moved, and if you go there, you'll see that they're in different places. So their challenge was how to turn a rocky 30-acre pasture with a 111-foot drop over less than 2,000 feet into a usable public space. They wanted to change the grading to make it appear more natural, less pathways, more simplified, irregular surfaces of land smoothed into a series of undulating wave-like slopes descending onto the hillside. Olmsted Jr. suggested that Fall River could save money by raising plants ourselves in a nursery on the shore section. And in fact, that's what they did. They built a nursery down there. So the area below the hill in the middle section was to be without structures below the hill and used for strolling and picnicking. Lothrop, remember the Fall River guy, added a lower pond as a drainage feature, adding a naturalistic water body to the Olmsted design features, much to the disapproval of John Olmsted. But he did that because he couldn't figure out how to drain that area from the water going down. So he said, oh, let's just build this thing and then the water can go in there. So this is the Olmsted Brothers preliminary plan for the shore section. In 1871, the railroad tracks separated the section. More waterfront purchased for, they suggested, for uninterrupted outlook north and west. Beach was intended for active use. This shore section is the best thing in the park, said Olmsted, and we're going to build a bridge over the tracks. In 1904, a sewer outlet had been added in 1898, directed down naturally the existing ravine. 4 lots of land purchased, and flights, this was what they suggested, 4 lots of flight of steps to lower path and down again to wider path along the beach. They said, quote, the existence of the sewer outlets at Williams Street and other parts north of the park beach makes it inadvisable for bathing on the park beach, even providing the outlet of the Main Street sewer were moved. And they advised to move the sewer to a southern park boundary because there were issues from odor and floating matter. So Olmsted Sr. had said, this is the best thing you got going for you is this lower section. You really need to preserve it, develop it. And by the time the sons come, there's a sewer there. John Olmsted said, it seems to us a most short-sighted economy on the part of the city to locate the sewer in this manner instead of carrying it out through the land and wharf of the Staples Coal Company and delivering the sewerage much further out into the current and much further away from one of the most attractive points in any of the parks of the city. Yes, did they move it? Yes, a little bit, but it's the same problem. So the city added stuff that was not a part of any plan. In 1899, they put electric lighting in the upper section. In 1895, a small pond for winter skating in the middle section. In 1896, the Cogswell Fountain, which was intended for South Park, but it was then put in South Main instead. In 1907, a shelter was built. In 2009, a playground. In 1909, a woman's comfort station. In 1911, the bridge. In 1955, a Statue of Liberty replica. In 1971, a bronze bell. A shore section had become a dump site for garbage and construction materials. In 1975, 4 tennis courts were added at Bay Street, just put there, no design intended. 1976, municipal swimming pool with a bathhouse. And this weird garage workshop is in a horrible location on the ledgy hillside at Bradford Avenue, which alters Olmsted principle of keeping utilitarian structures out of the park's recreation areas. And if you go by, it's a cement building. It is ugly as hell, and it just sits there and you go, who put this here? And why? So the city finances. Parks are almost always on the last of the list of priorities in any city budget. Prosperity, municipal bankruptcy, and then we had a municipal recovery. So by 1931, the city was bankrupt. Municipal finances were under the control of the State Board of Finance for 10 years. And meager appropriations for the maintenance as well as minimal funds for permanent improvements of the parks existed. So anything that was done was paid for by a series of bond issues and municipal loans. When Olmsted Brothers' contract terminated, much of their design for South Park and North Park remained unrealized. So we go to Ruggles Park. Let's look at Ruggles Park. 1868, an oak grove with a ledge, lots of ledge, pasture, where poor people gathered firewood and the neighbors dumped their refuse, until Olmsted firm began work on it in 1902. By 1905, most of the work had been completed. It's a square park with a steep drop from the northeast corner, has a dense population surrounding it, large number of children. So Olmsted created as much playground as possible, compacted into 9 acres with a handball court and a tennis lawn. This is Ruggles Park design from the Olmsted Brothers of 1905. North Park. Land acquired in 1883 by transferring 27 acres of the city farm to the park purposes. There's a 15% grade and extremely steep and rocky. Irregular eastern boundary with a church, a school, and a firehouse. Originally, the park was to be on the land just at the top of the hill. In 1905 design, the areas of pastoral green, recreational facilities, and drives were designed. Specified ball fields, cricket creases, and a wading pond. And I found out that the indentation that's at the upper part of North Park by Hood Street, you know how it goes down? Mr. Moniz here informs me, Bill Moniz informs me that that was the original cricket crease, and that's why it goes down. Ah, yay, I know that now. There was extensive grading, an open gymnasium and running track were going to be designed. By 1911, North Park was only partially developed. There was a baseball field, a wading pond, a lily pond, and a running track, and it was mostly used, well, not mostly, but it was also used annually for horse shows. The park area was increased by 50%, but the budget was only increased 10%. Here is their design for North Park. To absorb that. There's a lot of trees. Ball fields, yes? Ball field, ball fields, ball field, wading pond, track. Notice, again, this incredible amount of copses of trees, keeping us separated from the community around us, enjoying nature, but also this being mostly a recreational park, not a picnic park, not a grazing, that's people grazing, not cows grazing. It was a recreational, it was an activity park. Yes.
I was walking up top there near Highland Avenue the other day. And there's you can see an outline in the ground right about where that dock splotches. There's a series of 3 or 4 stairs leading down from it, and a granite outline. Was there a building there?
Yes.
Dock splotches?
I think so, yes, yes, yes.
Do you know if there ever was a building there? Anybody?
I think Bill's saying that there was a building there.
It's used for recreational equipment.
Yeah, recreational equipment, he said. Storage of recreational equipment.
Oh, okay. So it wasn't a pavilion of any kind?
If you go through the cut through from, what is it? Which street goes straight across the park? Not North Underwood. Okay, you go straight across, and you've got the Little League field and stuff over there, and you go straight across. You'll see an absence of trees, and they're doing their best to try to replant. And the tree organization in town, the tree planting, they're putting trees back in and trying their best, but there's a lot of openness, and because of that, there gets a lot of erosion from that. It's also where taxi cabs go to park while they're waiting for a fare. You see a lot of taxi cabs down there. And people have their lunch in their car there. They don't get out of their car to go into the park to eat their lunch as they're supposed to do by the plan of a park. They're sitting in their cars eating their lunch. So it's a car park, I guess. North Park, right. North Park was originally occupied 28 acres. In 1954, the city raised the men's gymnasium using approximately 2 acres for the Charles Carroll Elementary School. In 1983, it was nominated for the National Register of Historic Places within the Historic Highlands District. And in 2008, Fall River received a grant of $250,000 from the Massachusetts Historical Commission, with Fall River contributing 30% of this total to bring the park back as close as possible to the original design. They started working on phase 1. You notice the bottom of the park at North Main got a redo, got a rehab, and then they built a school there. So, South Park postcards. Ah, shall we recall the olden days of beautiful South Park? That was the entrance there. That fountain, I think, is still there. That's still there. I took a picture of it. What's that called when you walk? Perambulating, yes. These are all postcards, popular postcards. Yep. Fall River's parks. Parks are not seen in Fall River as historic entities, but a collection of facilities to meet the community's needs. There's no longer a view of the Capitol Dome in Providence. There's a loss of plantings. The buildings altered, the separation of spaces for different uses have been implemented. Additional athletic facilities creates congestion. There are few benches, few paths on which to stroll, and they're all uneven. The linking drive now ends abruptly, blocked by a tennis court. The entrance is defined by the workshop and a parking lot. Monuments dot the landscape, placed ad hoc, not articulated with the design. South Park today. This is at the bottom of the park, near the bridge, looking back up at the park. This is the bridge that goes to condominiums off to the side. This is the lower part of the park. It is still undeveloped. There is litter. People burn things down there. I think it might be a place, it still might be a lover's lane for all I know.
But the water's cleaner.
But look at the view. Lovely, lovely, lovely smokestacks. Yes. It just gets better and better. Nothing's paved. The dirt's uneven. No plantings. This is looking to the left. This is back up at the wading pool. Without water. This is the wading pool, and then the pool beyond. Yep, all concrete. This is just looking up towards the hill. There's one of those little boulders that got moved in a lovely place. This is from the parking lot. This is the strangest thing you'll see in a park. A very big concrete place with a very ugly thing in the middle. I think it's a monument of some kind to firefighters or something. Isn't it? No, in the center, that very center. No, but it actually has got a monument attached to it of some kind. Monument to Dairy Queen. So yeah, it's a big concrete space now that has nothing more going for it than that.
It's an ice rink.
It used to be.
Still used as an ice rink.
How often? It wasn't there that winter. Well, I was there when it was cold. There was no ice, there was no rink, there were no people ice skating.
There were tons of people ice skating.
When?
This winter.
Well, for how long? I'm just asking. Like a week? 2 weeks? A day? Well, did they fill it with water, or did they wait for it to rain and then it freezes?
No, they fill it with water.
Okay.
Once it's freezing for 1 week, then they fill it.
Okay.
And then people use it.
Excellent, excellent. I have never seen that. I can't wait to see it again. That would be fantastic. Yes, I would love to see that. But the rest of the year, it looks like this, right?
The rest of the year, people use it for bicycles and roller skating, and we even had roller derby.
Skateboarding.
Yeah. It's still, yeah. Yeah, the pavilion's falling apart again. There's Sliding Rock, yay, Sliding Rock. And the big trees.
Could be.
Monuments. Comfort station. Monuments. Yeah. There's World War II. The firefighters on the other side. It's the other side from here, on the other side.
There's the Revolutionary War monument without the soldier.
Without the soldier on top, yes. So you see, now this was done in the fall. These photographs were taken in the fall. There are no leaves on the trees, obviously. But there also aren't that many trees. So you see the buildings, you see the city, you hear the city. You are not at all in a space, as was thought to be, away from the city, a place for people to go to be away from the bustle, hustle of an urban environment. It looks like a green space in an urban space that it sort of blends in, and there's no demarcation because of the concrete and because of the amount of concrete within the space. And I think this is the firefighters. That was 9/11, September 11th. I remember going to that. But also notice, no matter wherever you go, there you go. You see the view. So that's the history of South Park.